All right, my clock shows 10 o'clock, so we'll get started here. Good morning to everybody. My name is Tyson Moore. I'm a supervisor here at DWD in the not-for-profit division. I want to take this time to thank everyone for joining today's webinar. We're going to cover board governance. With us today is Susan Berghoff, along with presenter Carrie Minnick. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to cover. For those who have questions during today's webinar, please use Zoom's question and answer feature. You should find that at the bottom of your screen. Both Susan and myself will be answering questions periodically throughout the presentation. Also, Carrie's slides will be emailed to everyone who's attending today's webinar, along with being posted to our website. Without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to our Director of Not-for-Profit Services, Carrie Minnick.
Thank you, Tyson, and welcome everyone. Today we are going to talk about board governance. So why are we talking about this? Well, first of all, the IRS believes that a well-governed organization is more likely to obey the tax laws, safeguard charitable assets, and serve charitable interests than one with poor governance. It also believes that an active and engaged board is important to the success of an organization. So of course, we all want our organizations to be successful. So we want to make sure that our board is active and engaged and understands what their responsibilities are. As we talk about some things today, I'd like to have you think about where your organization is in the nonprofit cycle, because some of the things that we talk about may vary depending on where your organization is. So just like other things that are affected by change, nonprofit organizations go through changes. These changes are caused by both internal and external environmental issues. They cause the organization to really grow and decline over time. So your organization's impact, organizational risks, your strategy, and even your governance are going to vary depending on where your organization is in the nonprofit life cycle. So when an organization starts, it starts with an idea and there's a startup phase. And at this phase, the founders are usually the board members. There's high energy. There might be some limited funding. It's a working board. So as opposed to a board that is focused on more oversight and governance, at this point in the cycle, the board members are really involved, maybe even doing some operational activities. For example, there's probably limited staff. So maybe the board members are taking on some HR duties or some marketing duties. So the board activities and what they're doing at the startup phase is probably going to be a little different than at a mature organization. So after the startup phase, an organization is going to move into the growth phase. So at this point, you're going to hire probably a more formal CEO. You're going to standardize and deepen some of your programs. Maybe some formal policies and procedures are starting to be put into place. Once your organization reaches the maturity stage, this is where you're going to have a lot of formal structures and processes in place. And then at this point, the board is really going to be a governing board. They're not going to be probably not into the operations, the marketing, that kind of stuff. They're going to be at a high level, approving strategy, that type of thing. Now, once an organization gets to that maturity level, you have to be careful, because if you get too compliant and don't adapt to change, the organization could go on to decline. This happens when an organization is settled. Again, they're failing to adopt or change. So at this point, the organization can either turn around, and if the organization is able to turn around, they're really going to have to evaluate some of the foundational issues of the organization. But if they can't do the turnaround, then they may have to, dissolve and either be merged by another organization or just close the doors completely. So again, as we go through and talk about some of the board duties and responsibilities today, they may vary slightly depending on where your organization is in the nonprofit life cycle. So first, we're going to talk about just some basic information about boards. So in Indiana, which most of the organizations with us today are Indiana organizations. So the state law requires a minimum of 3 board members. There's no maximum required. So you can have only 3 members, you could have 10 members, you could have 50 members. Now remember, if you have too few members, then your board members are going to feel overworked and they might get stressed out. However, if you have too many members, not every board member may have the opportunity to participate. They may not feel like they're actively involved. So you want to find that sweet spot that fits your organization. Average number of board members is 6 to 18. And again, it really depends on the organization. But again, for Indiana, you are required to have 3 board members, and the number of your board members is going to be set in your bylaws. So you want to make sure you are aware of what that number is. Next is term limits. The average term limit for a nonprofit organization board member is 2 to 6 years. Again, this term limit should be included in your bylaws. However, some organizations don't have term limits. So it's, again, up to the organization. There's pros and cons of both. So having term limits enables board members the opportunity to, to leave after a certain time period. You don't want an individual to just continue on the board if they're not being active, if they're not feeling like they're giving to the organization. You want to allow them to have an out. However, if no term limits are positive, if you find a board member that is doing a lot of good for the organization, you don't want them to leave. So it varies. A lot of the nonprofits that I work with do have term limits. However, there are some that don't. So that is, again, up to the organization, and that's going to be in your bylaws. If you do have term limits, again, it's usually a 2 to 6 year term. A lot of times it's a 3-year term, and you can serve 2 consecutive terms with a 1-year hiatus and then go and start serving again. One thing we recommend is staggered terms. So that way, not everyone is leaving the board at the same time. So you don't have that complete turnover. So you do get some consistency of people that have been been on the board for a while, so you don't lose that organizational knowledge. One thing to consider with term limits and bringing in new board members, a lot of times we focus on onboarding new members, which is great. That's what you want to do. But I think we also have to think about offboarding members. Your board members are some of your greatest supporters and ambassadors for your organization. So when they step away from that board position, it's crucial to continue a relationship with them. So anything that you can do to, continue to stay in front of them, to continue that relationship. Maybe they do want to consider continuing on a committee, but, maybe if they're done serving on the board and committees, invite them to the annual fundraiser, keep them on the newsletter list, just continue to keep them in on what's going on with the organization, because again, they are some of your biggest supporters, and to lose that is really detrimental to your organization. So as we talk about board members, it's been said that an organization should have an attorney, a CPA, and someone with a really large Rolodex on their board. So of course, those types of people are very beneficial. However, you need to access each potential board member as an individual to determine what they can bring to the board and to your organization, because each organization, again, is going to be different. So some members that you might want to be looking for, an attorney, they can likely provide general advice. However, you do need to be sure that if you do have an attorney on your board, it needs to be clear as to whether the individual is serving as a board member or as the organization's legal counsel, because there are some professional standards that they need to be mindful. Often an organization will seek out a CPA to be on their board, which is great. However, you need to also be mindful that not all CPAs have nonprofit accounting knowledge. Nonprofits have a very unique accounting standards requirements. And so just because someone has a CPA license, they might not understand nonprofit accounting. So really, it's better for an organization to have a board treasurer that might not have that CPA license, but has experience with nonprofit accounting, than to have someone that just has a CPA license and has never worked with nonprofits and maybe just focuses on tax. So again, that's just my opinion, but you really need to have someone financially savvy on your board that understands nonprofit accounting. You also want to consider inviting people with certain links to professions, geographic representations, community segments. For example, Habitat for Humanity likely will have home builders on their boards, because that is part of their program. So maybe an educational organization will have someone providing education, a professor or a teacher. So those kinds of things, look to see what kind of programming you're offering and what kind of people should be on your board to help out with those. Also, if you have clients, do you want to consider adding a client representation? Those people from your clients on your board. With anyone that you bring on the board, you just want to make sure that you want to strive for an independent board, which means you don't want all of the executive directors, family, and friends on the board. Now, that might be how the organization starts in that initial startup phase. But as you grow and mature, you really want to strive for an independent board, and also a diverse board. So diversity can mean a lot of different things, different backgrounds, different religious beliefs, different just in life. You want to get that diversity so that way they can all bring what their skills and backgrounds are to your organization to better improve your organization. And when you're looking at what kind of people who you want to join your board, a lot of organizations will use a board matrix. And I provided here an example. This is just one example of how one may work. And really what it does, it allows the board to inventory the skills and expertise of board members and to determine where there are gaps. This is, again, something that a lot of organizations use. You just want to be careful, though, that you're not just checking the box. So let's say you need someone under the age of 34 because you don't have any younger board members. You don't just want to get somebody that's under 34. You want to look at that individual to see what else they can bring to the organization. And then finally, all of your board members really need to be passionate about your mission. Board members that are truly interested and care about your organization are more likely to devote time, talent, and treasure to your organization than those that just kind of have a lukewarm feeling about the organization. So again, just kind of continuing with some board basics. The board is ultimately responsible for the organization. However, committees can be very useful in assisting the board with its duties. Again, committees cannot make governance decisions, but they can make recommendations to the board for approval. They cannot act in place of the full board. So that's very important to remember. The committee structure varies from organization to organization, but most nonprofits have a set of standard committees. For example, executive, governance, finance, and audit are common standing committees that you will see in a lot of organizations. Some smaller organizations might not have both a finance and audit committee. They may just have a finance committee who is ultimately in charge of the audit as well. Other committees that sometimes nonprofits have could be like an investment committee if they have a large endowment, resource development or fundraising committee, program committee, or HR committee. Smaller organizations may not have as many committees as larger organizations, just because they may be able to get the work done at the board level. Depending on the committee and the organization, some committees may allow non-board members to serve as committee members. Usually the executive and the governance committees, however, are restricted to just board members, but the other committees may be open to public members. And this is a great way for your organization to get more individuals involved, and also develop a resource for potential board members. So asking someone to serve on a committee before coming on board. Each committee should also be aware of what their duties are, have a charter, know what their responsibilities are. That way they can understand their focus and evaluate their accomplishments each year. And just real quick, some of the duties of each of the committees. Again, the executive committee. Some organizations will have a very active executive committee where they meet regularly. Other organizations, their executive committee will only meet in emergency situations. And again, that's just varies by organization to organization. Situations where an executive committee is less beneficial, again, is going to be where a smaller board, where the board is active and motivated. However, a larger board where maybe board members are scattered across the country, or there's controversial issues that need to be addressed right away, could be situations where an executive committee would be beneficial. Again, their role should be defined in the bylaws, and the executive committee cannot replace the full board. Again, the full board is the one that's ultimately responsible for the organization. Governance committee, they provide the governance work, expectations for board members, new board members, orienting board members. Finance committee, these are the financial people. Again, you don't have to have a CPA on your board, but you really want to have somebody that has that nonprofit financial understanding. And again, if the organization doesn't have an audit committee, normally the finance committee will oversee the annual audit if you have an audit. And if the organization has investments, but there is no investment committee, the finance committee may also oversee the investment performance of the organization. Officers of the board normally consist of chair, vice chair, secretary, or treasurer. Sometimes people will call them president, vice president. Again, it varies. It should be noted in your bylaws what their titles are. The chair or the president, obviously they're the ones that are in charge. They run the meetings. There is there needs to be a good working relationship between your board chair and your executive director or CEO, because they are going to work very closely for the operations of the organization. The board chair usually also acts as an alternate spokesperson in certain times where the CEO may not be available, or just depending on the situation. Obviously, the vice chair, they will step in if the chair is not available. They may be next in line for the chair position. This is an area that also varies from organization to organization. So some nonprofits will have individuals work through the succession of officers. So maybe they're first a secretary, then a treasurer, vice chair, and then the chair. Others will have whoever's in the vice chair become the chair the following year. And then some just don't follow that pattern at all. So it really depends on the organization. There's pros and cons of doing it different ways. If you have an individual that served as a vice chair first and then becomes the chair, it kind of gives them a year to get prepared, get in there, trained to move up to the chair position. But again, it varies on the organization, and it should be stated in your bylaws. Then we have the secretary. They're really the one that's in charge of the minutes, or at least reviewing the minutes if someone else takes them, providing notice of meetings. And then the treasurer, this is your financial person. Again, they're the ones that are going to understand the financial accounting, works with the finance committee, works with the audit, works with the budget. So again, having someone that has some kind of financial knowledge specifically to nonprofits is really going to be beneficial in this position. As far as meetings, it just depends. Some organizations will meet every month. And oftentimes organizations that are younger or have a lot going on will meet more frequently, so may meet monthly, while other organizations that are more in that mature stage will meet quarterly. So it just depends on the organization. One thing to keep in mind is quorum. So quorum is the minimum number of board members that must be in attendance to vote on official business, and your bylaws will state this. So if you don't have quorum, you cannot vote on certain, you can't vote on items. So you want to make sure that you have quorum, and so that you can get some business done. Some organizations will follow Robert's Rules of Order. Others will just follow pieces of it. So I think that's important just for when you onboard new board members, that they understand how the meeting works. If the organization does follow Robert's Rules of Order to a T, or if there's just pieces of it, just making sure that people understand how the meetings work. Making sure that you have an agenda, and then also making sure that someone is taking minutes, because the state law of Indiana does require that written minutes are taken and also maintained by the organization. We also want to make sure that when we take minutes, we don't write down every single thing that happens. We want to write down the significant discussions that are had, the significant decisions that are made, who's in attendance, that type of thing. And I wanted to provide just a sample board meeting agenda. Again, there's not one way to do this, but this could be an example of a board meeting agenda, having a consent agenda, which includes the prior meeting minutes, financials, maybe those items that don't take a lot of discussion, and we can just vote on those and get those out of the way. So that way we can move on to more pertinent things that need to be talked about, more strategic type of things. May have investment committee, finance committee, kind of some types of committee reports. These would be committee reports that need to have a little bit more discussion versus just standard reports that could be approved in the consent agenda. Also, board training, if you don't already do this, taking just a few minutes in each of your meetings to be able to provide some kind of board education is very helpful to your board. So those are kind of some basics, just kind of more technical things about board of directors. So now we'll talk about our actual duties. So there's both fiduciary duties, and then we're going to go in and talk about the 10 basic responsibilities of nonprofit boards that BoardSource has put together. So everyone on the board has 3 fiduciary duties: the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. So really you want to make sure that you are putting the organization, the nonprofit, before you, and taking reasonable care in all of the decisions that you make on behalf of the organization. So many of you are probably aware of BoardSource. BoardSource has put together 10 basic responsibilities of nonprofit boards. And so we're kind of just go through and touch on each one of these and what each one of these mean. The first is to determine mission and purposes and advocate for them. So your board is ultimately responsible for the mission statement and making sure that that gets carried out. There is a distinction between mission statement and vision. So mission is why your organization exists and what need is it meeting. The vision is more of what the community will look like if your mission is achieved. So you want to make sure that your mission statement is reviewed every so often to make sure there's not any mission drift. And also on your annual Form 990, the IRS requests that you report what that mission statement is. So we just want to make sure that yes, this is what we are continuing to do. So some things that your board members, as a board member, you might want to ask as far as this first responsibility: does your board mission need to be revised? Have we drifted from our mission? And does the organization's purpose articulate its goals? And then how can the board members, you as a board member, get the organization's story out? Because part of this first responsibility is also advocating for the organization, not just approving the mission and purpose, but advocating for your organization. Next, we have selecting the chief executive. So this is your CEO, your executive director. So Obviously, not everyone currently is searching for a CEO. However, you should have succession planning in mind. That is part of the board's responsibility to ensure that the organization is prepared for the future. So even if you aren't currently in search of a CEO, there should be a plan in place for their succession. Also, while the board is not involved in the everyday operations of the organization, there are some management responsibilities that fall on the board. And again, one of these is hiring the executive director, but we also want to make sure that we are aware of what the CEO's responsibilities are versus what our responsibilities are as board members. We don't want to step on the toes of the CEO. Also, the board has one employee, that's the CEO. All of the staff is under the CEO. So we are not going to be evaluating the staff. We're not going, that's the CEO's job. So our job is just to focus on the CEO. So we want to make sure that there are written job descriptions in place for the CEO. Do those need updated? What are the goals and priorities for the CEO, especially when you're looking to hire a new one? You want to make sure that those are clearly articulated. And then also, as I said, a succession plan. Is there a succession plan in place for the CEO? Whether that be if the individual needs to leave for short term or long term, or if they've decided they're done and they maybe retire or go on to someplace else. So if, for example, the CEO had COVID and couldn't work for a short time, who is going to step in and take over their responsibilities? So when we're talking about succession plan, yes, we're talking about a complete replacement of the CEO when it comes for that person to retire or they leave, but also we want to make sure we have a plan in place for if that individual has to leave for either a short period of time, either for family emergency, a sickness, or maybe a little bit longer time, but they are going to be returning. So we want to make sure we have that plan in place as well. Another one of our responsibilities is to support and evaluate the CEO. So we need to make sure that the CEO has the moral and professional support that they need to further the goals of the organization. So after selecting the executive director, it's really the board's responsibility to ensure that they have the continued support, the education, the training that they need, also feedback on their performance for them to be able to do their job. So, some of the things that we can do to show support of our CEO is attend board meetings. Make sure that you're on time, be prepared, read the minutes before you come to the meeting, not at the meeting, ask questions. Your organization should be evaluating the CEO, so you want to make sure that you participate in that. Introduce the CEO to other community leaders, your colleagues, give them opportunities to get the organization's good deeds out to everyone else. And just, really offer support during both good times and difficult times. The second part of this responsibility is evaluating the CEO. It is the board's responsibility to annually evaluate the executive director's performance, and this is usually headed by the executive committee. An annual evaluation provides an opportunity for the board to recognize accomplishments and to discuss any concerns that it may have about the executive director's performance. It's also a time for the board to clarify any expectations of roles and responsibilities. So maybe we thought we were very clear at the beginning of the year what we wanted to have done, but doesn't seem like that. So here's a chance to kind of talk through those. Some of the things that we should evaluate the CEO on are, are they carrying out the vision, mission, strategy of the organizations, management, fundraising, fiscal management, operations, relationship between the board, and then also the relationship with the staff. And then also their perception out in the public. So what are they doing out in the community? Because as again, the CEO, the leader of the organization, they have a lot on their plate. They cover a lot of different areas. So we want to make sure that not only are we evaluating these in them evaluating the individual in these different areas, but also we want to make sure that we are providing the necessary support and education for any areas that may need to have some improvement on. Next is ensure effective planning. So the CEO is responsible for designing and conducting the plan, but the board is responsible for setting and guiding the strategic directions. So we need to make sure as board members that a strategic plan is being done, that there is one in place, but we also need to participate. We need to look at the process, the results, approve the agreed upon outcomes, ask questions. That is a big one, because if you're asking questions, we want those questions answered now. What metrics are used to monitor effectiveness? A lot of times an organization will have a board retreat in order to do the strategic planning. That way they can just get away from everything and provides a more time to focus. So that way the planning can be more effective. And also when you do strategic planning, you want to make sure that it's not just a one and done. Yes, you've met, you've had your board retreat, you've invited someone in from the outside to lead your strategic planning, but you want to make sure that you continue to use that you just don't create a strategic plan and put it on the shelf. That's not going to be beneficial to your organization. So you as a board member need to make sure that that strategic plan is alive and it's addressed throughout the year. Next is monitoring and strengthening the programs and services. So we need to determine which programs are consistent with our mission. So again, we talked about the mission statement. Sometimes there may be changes within an organization, and that's fine. We may change our mission, but we need to make sure that those programs are consistent with what our mission says. Also monitoring program effectiveness, knowing which of our programs are our signature programs and why. So which one of these programs are, that's kind of what we're known for. That's what we do. You also need to know which programs generate revenue and which do not, and why. Some organizations will receive program fees to run certain programs, while other programs don't generate any revenue, but we still want to provide that program. So when we're looking at financial reports, we want to understand which of those programs generate revenue and which ones do not, and why we're continuing to do those. So some questions to ask are, what are the impact of our programs? What data will help us assess the effectiveness of our different programs? What difference are we trying to make in the community? And then how do we know if we're succeeding at our mission? Sometimes we might need to end different programs. We might need to say, okay, we're not going to offer this program anymore. We might have to reallocate resources. And sometimes that's a tough decision that the board might have to make. Sometimes these programs need to be cut due to a competitive environment, limited resources, limited staff, or maybe new opportunities. So also a lot of times that, maybe a board decision where we have to decide that we're going to cut some of these programs. So we need to make sure that we truly understand what programs our organization is offering, so we know which ones that we want to focus more on and allocate more resources to. Next is ensure adequate financial resources. So as board members, we need to ensure that funds are available for the organization to carry out their programs and their mission, but also we need to make sure that the organization does not spend beyond its means. So one of these things that kind of goes along with that is contributions, donations. You as a board member should give to your organization. If board members don't substantially support their own organization, why should anyone else? That's a lot of times funders will ask the percentage of board giving. So if your organization is not being supported by your board members, why should an external funder give to your organization? So you really want to make sure that you get 100% board giving. And it doesn't need to be thousands and thousands of dollars. That's great if it is, but it's really about making sure everyone gives something on your board. Some questions to ask is, do you know where your organization's support is coming from? Is it coming from a single source or only a few donors? Because if that happens, what happens to your organization if that source goes away? So let's say you get 85% of your revenue, your contributions from one funder. Okay, what if that funder suddenly decides, hey, we're not supporting this type of program anymore, so we are not going to be giving you this money anymore? What is that going to do to your organization? So you really need to be aware of any concentrations. Or for organizations that rely too much on government funding. Governments, you don't always know what's going to happen. So making sure that you're not relying too much on government funding in certain situations. So asking, should we develop more diverse funding? Should we get more individual contributions? Should we have program service fees? Should we go after different types of grants? Those are the types of questions to ask. And then along with that is, what is the sweet spot for our organization? So some organizations don't have any program service fees. There's no earned income. They rely 100% on contributions, which is fine. So they're like 100%, that's our optimal, that's our revenue mix. Other organizations are going to get a combination of contributions, earned income, government funding, et cetera. So what is that sweet spot that we want to strive for? What percentage do we want from contributions versus revenue, earned income versus government funding? So that's really something to think about, not only to know as a board member, but it also helps with planning for the future. And then again, I talked briefly about board giving, making sure that the board, 100% of board members do give something to the organization. So another question along with that may be, should there be an annual dollar goal be set for the board? So some organizations will say, okay, this year we want the board as a whole to give $10,000. So not necessarily individually, but as a whole, our board is going to give X dollars. Is that something that should be considered within your organization? And again, it just varies on the organization, but it's something to think about. Next is protecting assets and providing financial oversight. So again, many boards rely on the treasurer for financial oversight. So that's fine. Your treasurer is probably going to be the one that has more of the financial background and knowledge, but all of your board members need to understand the organization's financials. That is part of your job. So if your board members do not, or you as a board member do not understand your financials, ask. Have your, meet with your accountant or the person that does the audit for the organization. Have them explain to you. Have a training session. So that way, when you're looking at those monthly reports, you understand what you are looking at. Also, the board is responsible for reviewing and approving the annual budget. And again, just like the strategic plan, the budget is an active document. You don't want to just put the budget on the shelf after it's been approved. You need to use it during the year to see if you are on track. So making sure that, that budget to actual every month is where it should be. And if not, ask questions. Your organization might have an audit or a review done. Not all organizations are required to have an outside audit done, which is fine. But if your organization does have an audit done, the board is responsible for that oversight. So again, making sure that you understand what an audit is and what the audit results mean to your organization. And then finally, reviewing the Form 990. So that's your annual return, that informational return that is filed with the IRS. That is a public document, so anyone can go out there and look at it. So making sure that that is completed accurately and timely is very important. So again, some questions to ask. Should an audit be performed? So if you don't have an audit being done, is that something that should be done? So there are certain instances where an audit is required, but ultimately it is up to the board. Are your financial statements reliable and timely? Is the board getting the financial statements in a timely manner in order to review them to make decisions? So if you're not getting your monthly financial statements until 2-3 months later, that's really not helpful, because that you need timely, relevant information in order to make decisions going forward. And then also reserves. Should there be some reserves set up? Best practices say that nonprofits should have 3 to 5 or 6 months of cash on hand. So enough cash on hand to cover 3 to 6 months of expenses. So what are your current level of reserves, and does that need to be addressed? Next is building a competent board. So recruiting board members is an ongoing process. It's not, okay, we have enough board members now, so we don't need to think about it anymore. It is an ongoing process, and it is really the responsibility of the board members, not the CEO. So making sure that you maintain a list of potential board members to fill positions when needed, having that board pipeline. Also orienting new board members, so when you bring on those new individuals, that they are up to date on what's going on, providing board training when needed, and then also evaluating the board performance at the end of the year. As a board, are we doing our job? So some questions to ask for this responsibility: what constitutes a balanced board for our organization? So again, we talked before about the size of the board, what kind of skills, that board matrix, what are we looking for within our organization? And that's going to vary from board to board. Do we have written board member responsibilities and expectations, and have those been communicated to everyone? So we really should have some kind of written responsibilities, so that way everyone is aware of what they as a board member are responsible for. And then also committees. What committees do we have in place, and do those committees have charters that share what that committee is responsible for? Next is ensuring the legal and ethical integrity of the organization. So really, this is being responsible for adherence to legal standards and ethical norms, making sure that your 990 is filed properly, making sure that any other kind of government reports or grant reports are filed when they need to be, that type of thing. Conflict of interest policy, making sure that's in place. It's meaningless though if it's not monitored and adhered to. So you want to make sure that not only do you have a written conflict of interest policy in place, but that it's also being followed. Transparency, having clear policies and procedures, being aware of the questions that are asked on the Form 990, because again, that form is open to public inspection. So anyone can go in there and look at your organization's Form 990. And there are, unlike a for-profit tax return, there are more questions on Form 990 about the governance, who is on the board, what kind of policies and procedures are in place. So you really want to make sure that those questions are being answered properly, because again, that is out there for everyone to look at. Accountability, do you have a code of conduct in place? Do you have a whistleblower policy in place? Do you maintain adequate records? That type of thing. So again, some questions to ask: how does the organization keep up with the changing laws and regulations? So again, as a nonprofit, there are certain rules and regulations that you have to follow. So who is in charge within the organization for making sure that your organization is following those and implementing any new policies that may need to be implemented? And then the last one is enhancing the organization's public standing. Board members are ambassadors and advocates of the organization. So when we talk about advocacy, we're really talking about speaking in support of, recommending your organization. It's about education and educating your city leaders, your colleagues, the community about what your organization is doing, and that type of thing. It's not lobbying. Lobbying is more of a call to action in favor or against the legislation, but advocacy is really what nonprofits do every day in trying to advance their mission. So again, being a cheerleader for your organization, being out there and garner community support, whether it be just telling your friends and family about the organization, inviting them to special events, that type of thing. Some questions to ask here are: how are public policy proposals monitored? So if there's some type of public policy that comes out, how is that going to affect your organization? who speaks for the organization and what matters. Is it the CEO? Is it the board chair? And then is there a communication plan in place? Because again, this kind of goes on to the organization's public standing, their reputation. Your reputation is one of your organization's most valuable assets. And if something tarnishes that, that's really hard to come back from. So you want to make sure that you have a communication plan in place if something were to happen, and determine who is going to speak on behalf of the organization in those situations. So those were really, those 10 basic responsibilities are responsibilities of, the board as a whole. So individual board members also have responsibilities. And they piggyback on those 10 basic responsibilities, but they're also a little bit more in detail. For example, being informed about the organization's mission, services, policies, and programs, maybe visiting the organization while they're doing programming so you can actually see what the organization does. Attending board and committee meetings and functions. If you have a fundraiser, make sure you attend that. Again, attending board meetings, making sure that you review those materials before you get to the meeting. So that way, when you're at the meeting, you can ask intelligent questions and you can focus really on strategy. If your organization has committees or task force, make sure that you're serving on one of those. Again, make sure that you're giving to the organization, and then also advocating for the organization. One thing that you can also do is suggest possible board nominees. I know that a lot of nonprofits are looking for board members and they continue to look for board members. So if you know someone that would be good, suggest that to the board. Keep up to date on the developments in the organization's field. So if your organization serves in maybe a medical, does something with medical services, make sure that you're up to date on what's going on, or maybe education. Make sure it's just in general so that way you can better understand your organization and its place in that field. Make sure you sign conflict of interest statement, know what a conflict of interest is, follow confidentiality policies. Obviously, stuff that's discussed at board meetings is confidential. Again, we talked about how the board has one employee, the CEO. So refrain from making special requests of the staff that they are under the CEO. So you are just responsible for the CEO. And then assist the board in carrying out fiduciary responsibilities. For example, reviewing the financial statements. And if you, again, don't understand those, which is fine because we don't expect everybody on the board to be an accountant or to have a financial background. We don't want that. But ask for some kind of training so that way you can be a better board member. Some organizations will provide a board report card, and this is one way to assess your board members' performance. So a board report card is a tool that includes the key responsibilities of board members as individuals. So some of those things that we just talked about. So every board member has their own report card, and it's reviewed and updated at each board meeting for responsibilities that have been completed. So for example, the one here on the screen is for John Smith. So each organization should have written board member responsibilities, and these kind of, or job descriptions, and these kind of summarize those. So for example, this organization, they're required to attend at least 80% of all board meetings. So we have all of the months that they meet, and then as the individual attends those meetings, we're just going to check it off. One of the other things the board requires is to attend an organization's annual fundraiser, provide a meaningful contribution, participate in an annual ED evaluation. So these are only a few items, but it kind of shows, it gives a way to evaluate it during the year. Not only does it force board members to think about their contributions to the organization, but it also helps to improve board performance and provides a better understanding of the expectations. Normally this is headed by the governance committee. They'll maintain these cards, but again, it's not required, but it is an idea that some organizations do. So good governance is always, that's a key word. Everybody always talks about it. the board, a strong board is essential to the success of each nonprofit. Making sure that your board members are aware of their duties and responsibilities as nonprofit board members. They are ultimately responsible for the oversight of the organization. So my question I'm going to leave you with is, do your board members, are they aware of what their responsibilities are, what the fundamental governance concepts are? And if they're not, this might be a great opportunity to provide some additional education and board training for them. So that way they can become better board members, and then that will ultimately lead to your organization being more successful as a nonprofit. I'm not sure if anyone else has any additional questions at this point.
Let me kind of wrap things up here, Carrie, if there's no
Yeah.
questions. Okay. All right, I just want to remind everybody, this session was recorded. So the slides and video will be available on the DWD website in the not-for-profit section. A link will also be emailed out to everyone attending today. While you're on that page, our next webinar is going to be on April 13th. It's going to cover nonprofit financial statements, so be sure to register for that. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.